Welcome, everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, webinar producer with CGLR. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, subscribe to us at Campaign for GLR. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. And before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping details. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. We also encourage you to post any questions that you may have throughout the webinar in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as any slides, resources, and bios shared during the conversation, will be sent in a follow-up email to all who registered. And finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This updated poll helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And before we get started, I wanted to call your attention to some of our upcoming webinars. Next week on January 30th, we are so excited to welcome you to the kickoff of our new Kindergarten Matters webinar series. This premiere session will highlight emergent bilingual learners in the kindergarten year with conversation on how best to help students, teachers, and parents. In February, we'll welcome you to multiple learning conversations. On the 13th, we'll have a conversation on the bilingual science of reading at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And then on the 20th, we'll have an exciting Funder to Funder conversation focused on the reading universe, scaling teacher PD for student success. Registration links and more information for all of these sessions will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope that you can join us. And joining you now is Hattie Miles-Polka, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy.
Thanks, Sierra. Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to see so many people here for this really important topic. Thanks for joining us for another installment of our Big Bets Working series. Today's topic is engaging families for everyday attendance in partnership with Attendance Works, and we're just so grateful that they are partnering with us to guide everyone through this conversation. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel before we get started. Starting out with Francisco Baides, who is the Family Engagement Program Manager at the Capital Region Education Council in Connecticut. He's part of the team that created the Learner Engagement and Attendance Program, or LEAP, which helps school districts across Connecticut develop meaningful partnerships with families. He also created and manages the Connecticut Home Visit Hub, providing training, coaching, and support to districts and schools across the United States so they can build partnerships with families through relational home visits. We are also joined by Kari Sullivan-Custer, who is an education consultant on chronic absence, as well as attendance and LEAP home visits with the Connecticut State Department of Education. She has developed and delivered workshops, trainings, and publications to raise awareness and share best practices on addressing chronic absence. She's also coordinated statewide initiatives on physical activity, nutrition, and tobacco prevention, and collaborated with various stakeholders such as schools, districts, families, and community organizations. Nancy Duchesneau is a senior P through 12 research associate at the Education Trust, which is a national nonprofit committed to advancing policies and practices to dismantle the racial and economic barriers embedded in the American education system. Next slide for the rest of our panel. Angela Graves is the principal of Cornelius Elementary, as well as the elementary school early learning administrator for the Forest Grove School District in Oregon. Cornelius Elementary serves about 420 Cornelius Cougars, grades pre-K through 4, in the heart of the small family town of Cornelius, within 30 minutes of Portland. They provide students with the unique experience to become biliterate, bilingual, and bicultural. The staff provides a nurturing environment for students to gain a strong academic foundation to serve them for years to come. 100% of their students receive free breakfast and lunch, and Cornelius Elementary is a majority-minority school with about 95% Latino and 5% Caucasian or other races. Callie Thorne-Ladd is CEO of the Children's Institute in Oregon, where she has a long track record of working to transform early learning and healthy development for children and families. And finally, we are joined by Joellen Latham, the Executive Director of Curriculum and Instruction for Southeast Polk Community Schools, which is a district of about 7,000 students just outside Des Moines, Iowa. And finally, I'm very happy to be welcoming our moderator, Hedy Chang. Can go to the next slide, who is the Executive Director of Attendance Works. Hedy, if you want to go ahead and join us, I will pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that great introduction of an amazing set of panelists with such diverse perspectives. I'm going to start off by just making sure that we're all coming from the same page, have a little bit of basic information to ground us all in our current realities. So let's go to the next slide. We are talking about this issue of chronic absence. 10 years ago, no one knew what this term is. Now it's much more understood, but it's really missing 10% or more of school for any reason. That's including excused, unexcused absence, suspensions. It's meant to be an early warning metric that allowed us to know when kids are off track because they've just missed 2 days in the first month, 4 days in the second month, 6 days in the third month. And this is really different from truancy that only looks at unexcused absences, or average daily attendance, which looks at how many kids typically show up each school day and can actually mask high levels of chronic absence. Go to the next slide. The reason why we care about this is we want to ensure that we have attendance every day, especially for our youngest learners, because we know that kids who are chronically absent in pre-K and K are more likely to be chronically absent and less likely to read and count proficiently by the end of third grade. It's associated with declines in educational engagement, social emotional development, and executive functioning. And we know that when kids are economically challenged, the consequences of chronic absence are even worse because they have less access to the resources that help them make up for the lost opportunities to learn. And we also know, especially in the aftermath of a very challenging pandemic, which continues to have implications and social, emotional, and economic challenges that some communities are still grappling with right now, but that in the face of all that change, a routine of attendance is even more important so that families and young children feel less anxious about school, feel connected to their peers, and can access all those resources that are available at school to engage in learning and connect to each other. Next slide. So what we know is that we have an unprecedented attendance crisis that now nearly affects 1 out of 3 students. And we see from state data that it's still almost this high, though we've had a few modest declines. And some of that is promising and hopeful signs, but it's still much more elevated than before the pandemic. And we have over almost 15 million kids who are chronically absent now. Next slide, please. The thing, though, is it's not just the kids who are chronically absent that we have to be worried about. We also have to think about the many, many more kids who are now in schools with 20% or more levels of chronic absence. Before the pandemic, that was about a quarter of all kids were in a school with 20% or more levels of chronic absence, and now it is 2/3. And when you have such high levels of chronic absence happening, where it's 1 out of 5 or more kids in your school who are experiencing chronic absence, the churn is affecting everyone. It affects the ability of teachers to teach, kids to learn, the ability to set norms, and to make sure you're continuing to move forward with the curriculum. Next slide. And we know that elementary schools are especially feeling this impact, in part because we have many more elementary schools than any other, elementary schools are smaller. There are a lot of them. So we've seen the number of elementary schools with, let's say, extreme levels of chronic absence, 30% or more, shift from only about 3,550 schools before the pandemic to nearly 20,000. Almost 60% of all elementary schools, this is 21-22 data, are experiencing 20% or more levels of chronic absence. I care about middle and high school, but we got to get it right for our youngest learners, because the consequences of not getting it right, we're going to bear for many years to come. Next slide. And we know that dealing with what's happening in elementary school means we got to start in kindergarten or even pre-K. And this is just data from California, which shows how we have seen extraordinary levels of chronic absence in kindergarten. Before, it was more of a U-shape, and now the kindergarten chronic absence is especially high. Next slide. So what does this mean for us? It means we have to partner with families to ensure, and in many cases, restore positive conditions for learning that really help make sure kids and their families see school as a place that they want to be. We have to make sure that families know, see, and feel that school is physically, emotionally healthy and safe. That kids and their families feel a sense of belonging, connection, and support. That they feel engaged academically and challenged, and that school they see as a place that will help them to get to this better future and is relevant to a better future. And they are surrounded by adults and students with the well-being and emotional competence so they can invest in the relationship building that is so key. This has always been important, but during the pandemic, I think the shift to virtual learning, the disruptions in learning, the unknowns about COVID sort of it undid some of these conditions. Some families might not have experienced them very much before the pandemic, but many families during the pandemic and after now have to restore these positive conditions for learning. And the fact that they're not so in place is reflected in these high levels of chronic absence. Next slide. And it means that we have to take an all hands on deck to ensure a tiered approach that starts with those positive conditions of learning. And then we continue to do universal prevention, like messaging to families, saying we miss them. Tier 2, like mentoring and additional relationships to families for whom Tier 1 and universal supports aren't enough. And then Tier 3, which means we have to have even more intensive coordinated supports. But this is predicated on really putting in place those foundational supports in Tier 1. When you have high levels of chronic absence, it means you have to deepen your investment in prevention. Otherwise, the systems get overwhelmed. Next slide. And one of the ways we can also do that is starting with this really focus on kindergarten. I know you're going to talk more about the kindergarten as a sturdy bridge, but that is such a key transition point. And we have an early matters toolkit that helps you think about how do we start this? Reaching out before kindergarten, really emphasizing warm welcome and engagement, partnering with families all year long, making sure we address supports around health, because we know families are still so confused and concerned about when to keep their kids home when they're sick, and not necessarily, we don't have in place all the prevention that we need to make sure kids don't get sick in the first place. And then we need community partners to help us do this and to engage in our attendance campaigns so everyone recognizes and understands the importance of this. I think as you see this here from our panelists today, you'll have much more depth and much more vivid examples of what it means to carry out some of this work. So with that, I'm going to start by opening up to our panels, because I am panelists, because I'm so excited to have this incredible wealth of partners who are here to help show what this looks like in action. So if we can go, why don't we actually turn off the slides for a second and open it up to everyone. And we're actually, just so you guys get a flavor for the richness in our panels, we're going to do a quick round of going to our panelists and asking each of them just to share in one quick sentence, why does family engagement matter for attendance? And Joellen, I'm going to ask you to start.
All right, thank you. My name is Joellen Latham, and I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning at Southeast Polk. And I believe that relationships, both student-educator relationships and parent-school relationships, are crucial to family engagement, and that these partnerships improve attendance and learning.
Angelo, please.
Hi there, I'm Angela Graves from Oregon, and I'm a principal of an elementary school here. And it's really simple. Family engagement matters because if we don't have the families, we won't have the students, and we need the students. It's that simple.
Callie.
Hello, everyone. Kelly Thornlad. I would say families are important because families are first teachers. Whether they are good or bad, they are the first most influential people in a child's life. So that's why families are important.
Wonderful. Francisco.
Positive family engagement is foundational to a shared understanding of why attendance matters and for building partnership to overcome barriers to attendance.
Thank you so much. Kari.
Parent engagement is important to attendance so that we have equal partnerships between families and educators that are trusting and positive and all working for the best interest of the child.
Thank you. And Nancy.
Hi, everyone. Nancy Duchesneau with the Education Trust. Authentic family engagement is the Rosetta Stone for understanding students and families' experiences. And it's also the keystone for improving so many of the factors that we care about, including student attendance.
Thank you so much. So what we're going to do in the next section is we're going to start by hearing about what are the effective strategies that our colleagues here have seen put in place and how do they know they work. Then we're going to talk about, well, how do you equip schools, communities, districts to do this work? And then we're going to ask a little bit about what's the role of community partners. We know that it's not just about schools alone, but community partners. And then we're going to have a conversation about scaling and what does it mean to take this to scale. And then we will have a chance to have all of you ask your questions. Let's now shift to this question about what are effective strategies? And we know that you have data that even shows this works. So Joellen, why don't you start off? Tell us about what you've seen working in Iowa.
Well, thank you. Yes. And one of the things that we really see making a difference is having that positive rather than punitive approach to attendance and to school attendance. So if we look at the next slide, we have found that if we can move from that punitive to positive, and rather than compliance, you have to go to school, look at all the opportunities that you have to learn when you do come to school. So not focusing on what happens when you don't come to school, but what happens when you do. And we feel that this creates an environment that strengthens that family and school partnership so that when we do need to reach out, we can reach out in a positive way to work together to support the learning of each student.
And Joellen, I'm going to ask the campaign to highlight you because I think it might just be highlighting me and I want folks to see you as you're talking. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And on the next slide. So we had a campaign, we brought together an attendance task force. We really wanted to build that through social media posts. We have posters in schools and community locations. We have a lot of parent communication resources. We put the academic calendar on a refrigerator magnet and handed that out to families at registration. We have flyers, caring conversations training, and it really is important also to be able to have regular access to the data so that we can monitor and make adjustments. We can celebrate improvements. Our at-risk coordinator had activities in September for K-5 Friday morning greeters, so that we had football players, police chief, firemen, etc., that would greet the kids on Friday morning, and then sending note cards with personalized messages, how we missed them and we're glad when they return. On the next slide, you can see that you can see an example. These are some of the posters, as well as the magnet that parents have on the refrigerator, a QR code to our calendar. And you can see that we adopted the Attendance Works Glad You Are Showing Up Together with the hashtag Glad You Are Here to have a positive pathway. On the next slide, you can see what we've noticed with students and attendance, particularly you'd mentioned early grades. So when we look at our early literacy district data at Southeast Polk, we saw that last spring, 73% of our K-1 students were at or above benchmark on the measure of early literacy. So we want that to be 80 or above. We had 21% of those students who were chronically absent during the school year. So of the students who met their attendance goals, on the next one, If they were on track for attendance, the percent at or above benchmark was 86%. And for our students who were chronically absent, 60% met the grade level benchmark. So we know being in school matters. It supports that early literacy learning that is so critical at those grades. And we really wanted to showcase that for our families, for our students, for our teachers.
Great, thank you. And we're going to keep going through. So if you have questions for Joellen, you can put them into the Q&A. Joellen might have a chance to respond to them if she's not talking, because we're going to go to a couple of folks. And then we will also have a chance at the very end to have a dialogue with all of you with cross-cutting questions. I'm going to now turn over to Angela and have her talk about, from Oregon, what are you seeing? What works to improve attendance, and how do you know it's helping?
Thank you very much for that. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So before I talk, I want to just prove that what we're doing is working, because it's like, why should you listen to me? And by the way, as everyone else is talking, I'm taking notes too. So I hope some of this is helpful to you. So I wanted to show pre-pandemic data compared to now. So you can see on March 12th, when the world shut down, up to that point, we had a pretty good attendance rate of 94% almost. And then it dropped down during the pandemic. No surprise to anybody. We stayed above 90. But then, you know, it was confusing. Like Hetty said, it was confusing for parents. When do I send my kid to school? You told me not to send them to school for this, that, and the other. And so trying to firm up when kids should go to school or not was really important. And we are now up to 92.11%. And I'll tell you how we did that. Next slide. So one of the first things that we did was work on prevention. So I really focus on attendance in my communication with parents as a principal. So in the summer, I send out a summer newsletter. I make sure the parents know the kids do not get any vacation days. They only get 15 sick days. Their vacations are built into the calendar of the year. There's Thanksgiving break, winter break, spring break, summer break. That's when you take your days. And then I also share in my letter, this is what happens when kids are chronically absent. They are less likely to graduate from high school. They have fewer literacy skills and math skills, etc. So that's part of our prevention. Go to the next slide, please. And then we also send a preventative letter out in September for our families who struggled with attendance from the year before. And it's not a gotcha letter. It's really compassionate, empathetic. And we're just trying to say to them, like, we know you struggled with attendance last year. These are the reasons why your kids should attend school. And we would love to partner with you to make sure that happens. Next slide. So then what we do is we have an attendance team that meets once a week. And we just met this morning, and we focus on the kids that have 80% or less attendance on a daily basis. But we also look at those kids that are between the 80 to 90% mark too. And so the first step is we have a phone call home from the case manager. What's going on? How could we help? That doesn't work, then I call home as the principal. What's going on? How can I help? And then we will also have a parent conference would be the next step. We print out the attendance data in black and white and red so the parents can see, oh, wow, you know, my kid has missed a lot of days this year. What's going on with that? And then we discuss how we can help. Going to go to the next slide. That's building that relationship and those positive connections. Another thing we'll do at that point is we'll do student empathy interviews. So these are the questions that we ask the students, and we don't tell them we chose them because they don't attend school regularly. We say, oh, we just want to see how things are going here at school, and we randomly selected you, but we select the kids that aren't showing up at school. And we have very open-ended questions. Tell me about a time you were excited to come to school. Tell me about a day you weren't excited to come to school, and what would help you want to come to school more. And then you can see on that slide, that's our data from March of 22. And the bigger words, we just did a word cloud with them, are, you know, what the kids said the most. A lot of them wanted to come to school. They're excited to come to school because of their friends or holidays or recess. And then when were they not excited to come to school? It was hard getting up early. One girl was like, when it rains. And I'm like, well, you live in Oregon, so you need to come to school even when it rains. So next slide. And then if those things don't work, then we do send a formal attendance letter home with the individual student's attendance data so that parents can see which actual days in a calendar format that the kids have not been attending. We'll do home visits by our attendance team. And then ultimately, if none of that works, we'll have a family meeting with me, the principal, to strategize how we can get the kids to come to school more. Next slide. Every student, every day who doesn't show up, if the parents don't call in, doesn't matter what grade level this is, if the parents don't call in the kid absent, then an auto dialer goes out and as well as an auto email goes out automatically every day with every absence. So that makes it so parents know if their kids are at school. That's especially helpful at the middle school and high school where parents may not know that information. Go ahead and go to the next slide. This is a strategy I really want to highlight. I'd love my whole school to do this, but our pre-K teachers at our school send a short video of their class, just like 5-10 seconds saying, "We miss you." And it's the whole class saying, "We miss you." And they send it to the parent of the student who's absent. And that really motivates the kids to come back the next day because they want to see their friends. And then one trick that I have learned that works with like 100% of people is texting parents works wonders. I just send it from my personal cell phone. I don't even do a Google number. And everyone checks their text messages. Even if they don't have their phone turned on, when they're in Wi-Fi, they get text messages. They don't have to check their voicemail or emails. People don't like doing that. People want a text message, and texts have a 100% open rate. So I found text messages work wonders. Next slide. And that's all I have for you right now.
I just want to make sure that Callie has a chance. I think before we go to Connecticut, I think she was going to maybe offer up a couple comments. So but before we do that, Callie?
Well, that was just a fantastic summary of everything. I think if I were to summarize, Children's Institute looks at statewide what we see, and I think Angela illuminated the main pieces. I think the bottom line, build trust, commit to working with families, identify the root cause of the issue and look at that data, lift up that data so everyone has shared understanding, and then make individualized plans for children. We can often make assumptions about why children are going to school, and what we find is when people do the work like Angela is doing, they're able to have a tailored approach that is effective. That's all I have to offer.
Thanks so much. Well, you'll be back. All right. Thank you so much, Oregon. Now we are going to shift back over to Connecticut and have Francisco Beres talk to us about what they've been doing, particularly with the learner engagement and attendance program.
Thank you, Hetty. Thank you, everyone. Before we get into some of the particular strategies around LEAP and the data, I just want to kind of, for those who may not know about it, LEAP is Connecticut State Department of Education research-based relational home visit model that has proven to increase student attendance and family engagement. So at our outset, LEAP districts were strategically selected for funding based on a variety of criteria, such as percentage of multilingual learners, percentage of students eligible for free and reduced price meals, and of course, chronic absence rates. Now that we've been a few years in, we are very excited. LEAP training is provided to individuals and teams from schools, districts, and states across the United States, and we have folks joining us from Canada as well. Next slide, please. So talking about some of the strategies when we're looking at LEAP, I kind of unpack kind of our cornerstones and kind of operational components. So at the programmatic level, through and throughout the entire enterprise, it's flexibility. So at the district level, we can talk about district-specific plans that are based on their context and their capacity. So, for example, whether they're going to be leveraging the teachers as home visitors or not, whether they're going to be partnering with community-based organizations as resources, assets for this work or not. That's up to the district to determine based on context and capacity. And at the family level, number of visits aren't predetermined by us or even by the district. It should be based on the family's needs and their comfort level and their ability to partner with the school for this exercise, for this enterprise, I should say. So another thing is that it's voluntary for all involved, whether it's staff or families. It's data-driven through and through. Again, I've already spoken how data was used to determine districts we would start working with, but also districts are using data to determine which students they're going to be focusing on. And then again, or I should say, training and support through the Connecticut Home Visit Hub. So it's ongoing training and support that's provided. At the
Francisco,
operation, go ahead.
could you just give a picture? What does a LEAP home visit look like? If I were your family getting it, what would it look like?
Good question. So we start our training, the LEAP 101, which again is open to everybody here. We start the training with the very first phone call. So before we even get into the first home visit, you should be laying the positive foundational groundwork to build relationships that turn to partnerships with your phone call. Because for too long, school systems have relied on calls that, let's just say, are not the most pleasant, warm, friendly-minded building partnerships. So we start that in those first phone calls. So families have an understanding, oh, they're not calling to scold me or get at me or et cetera. It's we want to have a conversation and build a partnership. So going into the home visit, we're listening to families, right? So I come from the background of community program development, community organizing, and I was trained very heavily in those spaces that the conversation should be an 80-20 split. So instead of me just talking at families the whole time, I'm really asking open-ended questions to try to gain an understanding of what the families are going through, what their realities are, what they're doing to overcome obstacles and barriers. And then I ask them, how might I be of support and uplift them and partner with them to ensure their success? So instead of just talking at them, coming and then dumping out a bag full of resources and say, hey, do this, do this, do that, having that kind of approach, it's more of me asking questions and trying to get to understand and get to know the family, right? Think about it as we talk about the way doctors might engage with a patient. If you're going in there and you're meeting with a doctor and there's something going on and you don't even feel like that person knows you or cares to understand what's going on with you, and they're just telling you what to do, you might not have the best impression of why you might be following that doctor's advice, even though they're a doctor, right? They're a specialist, et cetera. They have the credentials, but relationships matter. Partnerships matter. And we can't build relationships and cultivate partnership if we're not listening to families, not trying to understand through empathy and understand what's going on and how we can uplift them. It's also about realizing that they're the leaders in this work and we're here to support them, right? I think Joellen said it really well at the top with her explanation about that mindset shift. That's something we talk about a lot in Connecticut as well, not just in terms of home visitors, understanding that there's a mindset shift there, visit by visit, conversation by conversation, but in schools and in districts, leaderships have to understand that we're moving away from punitive approaches where we're just sending out deputies to bang on doors at dinner time and to scare families and threaten them with courts. That's not going to do it. We need to get
Francisco, I can only imagine that given what happened during the pandemic with almost families losing trust and faith in school, that what you're having to do is take the time to restore faith.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's one by one, and we need to slow down, conversation by conversation, family by family, student by student. We want to have this magic brush, and we just, fix it all overnight with some silver bullet magic program, etc. It's really about slowing down, having these relationships, building these relationships with intentionality and respect with families, and trying to listen and learn what's going on. What I like to say is, when we're connecting through these positive relational home visits, we're not correcting families here. We can't be looking at families as problems to solve, cases to crack, etc. It's a positive approach to building relationships, and it's strength-based. So we're providing support also with not cultivating dependency. It's all these different nuances. So, all these small things matter. It sounds kind of hokey. It might sound, too much pie in the sky, but we're really seeing, and Kari will talk about this here in a second, we're really seeing some impacts to this mindset shift and operationalizing it, right? It's not just, it cannot be a marketing campaign like, oh, we care, and then really when students and families get in front of our staff, they don't feel like that people care for them. It has to be intentional, it has to be real, and it has to be authentic. And so, that's where it starts.
Thank you so much. So, Kari, what do we know about how home visits have they had an impact?
Oh my goodness, following Francisco is something else, all the enthusiasm. Thank you, Francisco. If you go to the next slide, yes, indeed, the LEAP learner engagement and attendance programs have seen an impact. We have in Connecticut what we call the Center for Center for Connecticut Education Research Collaboration. It's a partnership with our higher ed. And one of our initiatives that have been focused on is this partnership to evaluate how we're investing our funds. And so an evaluation was done on LEAP, and what it found was that visits that were made in person had more impact than virtual visits or phone calls. We call them home visits, but what we mean are in person. They don't have to be in the home. They can be at Dunkin' Donuts or a library or the park. So 1 month after the initial home visit, there was a 4% point increase in attendance. Mind you, LEAP is a multi-visit strategy, so it's not one and done. We visit the family, we make follow-up phone calls and establish this relationship. 6 months after the initial home visit, there was a 10% point increase for pre-K to grade 5, and for the older students from grade 6 to 12, after 6 months, we saw a 20% point increase for grade 6 and 12. The results did not differ based on the title of the person conducting the home visit. It didn't have to be a certified or a non-certified teacher, and it didn't matter if it was a home visitor from the school or from a community-based organization. What mattered is that they were trained and that they cared and that they were kind and friendly with families to build that support. And that comes out in the qualitative evaluation as well. If you go to the next slide, this is one of my favorite parts of this evaluation, is that we found unexpected benefits. They saw improvement in family-school relationships, improvement in engagement. This is from the families themselves and our home visitors. Improved achievement, improved belonging and gratitude. We wanted improved attendance, but we got all of this other really rich improvements as well.
That's so impressive. And Kari, if I remember correctly about this implementation, you were also very intentional around connecting families back to the school. So
Yes.
that family-school relationship isn't just because they've developed a relationship to the home visitor. Can you just say a little bit more about that in the model?
Yes, it is. There is a strong school connection with the home visit. In Connecticut, if the school attendance teams decide who receives this home visit, and then they go out and they do the home visit, and oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought. Francisco.
Yeah, so the way we built the program was that it's a series of visits, and Hetty, you're exactly right. That was in mind. So like, for example, because we see this a lot in the work where people are like, let's say I'm a home visitor, right? And Hetty, I've been visiting with you and we have a great rapport and you know that I have your back and we're working together so your child is successful. But let's say I win that winning lottery ticket and I'm out and I move. All of a sudden for you, your one champion in the school is gone and you have to start over. The school loses contact with the family. We don't want to do that. So we tell the home visitors, and part of the training I talk about, you need to connect that relationship. It's about bridging that relationship back to school so that that they have a sense of belonging to the school community beyond their relationship with you. And so we see that happen in multiple ways, and I could talk more about kind of nuances and how
We
that
will
happens.
do that more on the equipping,
Right.
but I just wanted to pull out that piece because
Yeah.
this piece
Very
of school engagement is so important.
Right.
All right, I know we're going back and forth across these different models. There's common themes, common challenges, but then also some intricacies. I'm going to actually now go back to Joellen and back to Iowa for a second and have Joellen talk a little bit more about, and you started your conversation with talking about you got to shift mindsets too. And that's about equipping schools to adopt this. So you all were able to do all this messaging, do this work. What did it take, and if we can go to the next slide, to really equip schools and staff to adopt the strategies that you were offering up as a district?
Exactly. So we spent a lot of time just studying the data and seeing the needs and looking as to what the research suggested was best practice. And we had put together an attendance task force to make recommendations to schools and staff of different steps we could take. Someone had asked in the chat, we have 8 elementaries, And so one of our elementaries on the next slide, if you see Delaware Elementary, they were very concerned about their attendance rate and they didn't want to wait. So they wanted to get going and get started. So we started kind of a pilot program with them so that we could start small and scale it up as we moved forward. So you can see the information about Delaware Elementary. That township is actually located in Des Moines, part of the Southeast Polk District. So this was the district that, or the building that we first began our pilot. And like Angela had shared, they put together an attendance team. They met weekly. They looked through the data. They looked at their communications with families. They looked at some of the reasons. As you've mentioned in the chat, not everyone's absent for the same reasons. And they began to reach out to families and to have those conversations as they moved forward. They wanted to have the students get off to a positive start, to get some good routines going, and to see that balance between attendance and learning and what that looked like for their students. So on the next slide, you can see in the 21-22 school year, this is Delaware Elementary, and you can see the levels of chronic absenteeism at each grade level. So after putting in this positive approach that focused on relationships, that used data, that worked with families and communities, you can see on the next slide that they improved attendance at each and every grade level. So one thing that helps is seeing progress and growth. This really excited the staff. It really excited the families. They were very proud of the results that they put together. And then if you look last spring at our impact on student learning on the next slide, ISASP is our state assessment. Third grade ELA went down just a bit. It went down more at the district level, but you can see at every other grade level, they made tremendous growth in both math and ELA and science, along with their improvement attendance. So to see that direct link between coming to school and learning, and to see the link between the efforts that they made in a positive way and the relationships and engagement and the improvement in attendance was very motivating. And they are continuing to add strategies and build those partnerships for this school year. And they're continued to be excited about the possible results.
That's fabulous. And I bet they're serving to be an inspiration for other schools in your district to adopt similar strategies.
Absolutely.
All right, I want to turn to Angela and Callie and to have them share in Oregon. What did it take to equip your schools to really do this work?
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I know this is a question in the chat. It's a team approach at our school. So we have an attendance team that meets weekly on Tuesday mornings, and we look at those students who attend school less than 90%. Those are chronically absent students. And I do want to make a note here that last year we had 36% of our students were chronically absent, and this year 23% of our students at our school are chronically absent. So that's a really big improvement. What we do is we assign a case manager. So the team consists of our school counselors. We have 1.5 school counselors, our migrant liaison, our student supervisor, which is kind of like a classified dean position, myself, the principal, and our district attendance liaison. He goes to all of the different attendance team meetings from every school. So that also helps us stay a little bit more on the same page from school to school. And then we each get a grade level. And so when we're going through our lists and the data is already put up ahead of time, so we can see how many days absent they have, as well as what is their percentage of school attendance. And then say, I'm 4th grade. So if it's a 4th grader and we're like, okay, this kid is still not making improvement in the attendance. Have we done a phone call home? Nope. Okay, so I'm up because I'm the case manager for 4th grade. But if it was a 2nd grade student, then the counselors already made their phone call and they're like, that didn't make a difference. So now you as the principal, can you call home? And then I do that. So we each take a grade level to make our initial phone calls and connections with the parents. and then we move along through the systems. That team approach is really important. It can't be one person. If you have a big enough school where you have an attendance secretary, the attendance secretary cannot be your only attendance person. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And then it's important to have either a process or a policy at your school or your district, and make sure that that's applied across your system. So, and it really doesn't matter what your process is, as long as you all agree on it and it's applied consistently. So it's not like, oh, this student got a letter, but this student didn't. And it's really seamless across the system. Go ahead and go to the next one. And then it's really important that you share that attendance policy or process with your staff at staff meetings, in your handbook, in your newsletter, in an email, and then share it with your parents as well, so that everybody knows it's not a secret how you're addressing attendance issues at your school.
Thank you so much, Angela. I think you're really pointing out the point of having official policy that backs up what you're doing. Really appreciate that. I'm now going to go over to Connecticut and ask Francisco and Takaris to talk a little bit about how, because you did this in 14 school districts, how have you equipped folks to take to adopt these strategies and LEAP, this relationship building approach?
Can you go to the next slide, please? So LEAP home visits don't stand alone, but the systems and structures that support the LEAP implementation, right? So important to know attendance teams are in place. The attendance teams meet on monthly or every 2 weeks. We encourage that there's an administrator led, and that's where you look at your data and you look at who are those students who are at tier 2, who have missed between 8 and 12% of the school day so far, and what are the root causes behind those students, and should they have a home visit? Would that be effective? We also found that with LEAP, districts were most effective if they had a district level and a school level coordinator who can make the connection between the family, the school attendance team, and the family, and the home visitor and the classroom. So having those coordinators at the district and school level. Another thing that I think is just so important is the data collection and monitoring. We have a home visitor log, which is just, after the home visit, there's always two people on a home visit. And so they complete this home visitor log. One of them or together, they do it. And they tell us what are the reasons why the student is not coming to school? What did you learn? What happened at the home visit? That's really rich data that we get back through a Qualtrics form that we can analyze and inform state level and district level structures and systems and policies about what families are telling us. And that data is also used to inform the school tennis team, but we also use data to decide, I think I've said this already, who gets the home visit. Our community partners, when we decided to put boots on the ground and we were building this in January, February 2021, our schools were inundated. Everyone was isolated. Families were isolated. School teachers were overwhelmed with hybrid learning, teaching remote and kids in the classroom at the same time. So it was really important for us to engage those community partners to help reach out to families who were scared, who hadn't connected to school and weren't connecting through remote learning. And so in many of our cities, we used city youth services, community partners, YMCAs were used with older students. They found that the older students really liked the young adults who worked at the YMCA, and that worked well, or the Boys and Girls Club. And listening to family and student voices. Many of our districts had youth focus groups where they brought the older students in and heard from them, why are you missing school? What is happening? How can we make you want to come to school? What makes you want to come to school? We did a survey of over 5,000 families to find out why aren't their students coming to school and what would help them to come to school. And that was really interesting. And some of the, of course, illness, mental health issues, lack of people at school who talk their language, so they feel really isolated, the students and the families. and lack of enrichment programs that are of interest to students of different backgrounds. And so some schools tend to have the same types of enrichment activities, but making sure you're listening to your family and students and making the school a setting where they want to be. And so the next slide shows you a lot of this information is in our LEAP effect, which we just recently produced. It's a publication all about our LEAP. It was the LEAP story. It was written in partnership with Hetty and Attendance Works and our partner, Francisco at CREC. And Ed Advance is our other partner, and it has the background and context about LEAP. What is the LEAP model, the core components, our lessons learned, some of these structures that I and Francisco has spoken about, and the evaluation. So we wanted to share that with you because you can't just say, hey, do home visits and we're going to have the success that Connecticut had, because this was done within the framework of a lot of other work that was happening in Connecticut.
All right, there's a question that I want to ask you, and I don't know whether Callie might also want to weigh on this one, but it's connected. There's a question in the chat about what do you say to administrators who really want to take a more punitive kind of law enforcement approach? How do you help them understand that's not going to get them to the
Right.
where they want to go?
Yeah, I would point to the research that has shown that the punitive effects if strategies do not have the impact that we're looking for. In fact, that it's shown that it's driven families away. So I would use the research, but I would also talk about, the importance of building that relationship. In Connecticut, we did away with truancy courts probably 5-6 years ago now. And so we've been trying to move in that direction. There still are those folks who will say, look at the punitive. And I'm going to turn over to Callie.
I just wondered if in Oregon, if that's also an issue that's come up in something.
It has come up. It's come up in some of our remote areas. Oregon, like many states, have urban communities and we have rural frontier communities. And I was actually at a educational service district meeting, which was made up of many rural and frontier communities where this did come up. And fortunately, the leadership, the superintendent of this service area understood the research and really pushed back against having to do this more disciplinary approach. I think the research is clear. I would say that the intention of having those officers go out is because they want kids to come to school. And so understanding that there are other techniques and understanding what the barriers are, I think helps sort of soften and shift. There's been a lot of conversation about shifting paradigms and shifting ideas in our head and our schema around what works. I think that takes time, but because everybody is focused on children succeeding, we can get there when we present them with research-based strategies and really take time to listen to families.
Thank you. And I want to bring everyone back on. This is back to the, so we'll pull out everyone on screen. And I want to probe a little bit more into this issue of bringing in community partners. And Callie, maybe since we're on you, we'll keep you going while we bring everyone else. But how have you helped districts? What's been the role of community partners in the work that you all have been doing? And how have you been able to leverage them or help your schools leverage them?
So I feel like I should start by saying we're a community-based organization at Children's Institute. We're statewide, so we work with districts all over the state. We work with urban communities. We work with communities like Forest Grove, and we work with our rural and frontier communities. And one of the things that we do as an outside entity is bring our communities together. We facilitate conversations using improvement science, using human-centered design, believing that there's a lot of wisdom in the room. And sometimes it takes an outside partner to sort of facilitate a conversation that can bring the ideas together and then document those ideas and bring, share them back out to the school. So we believe there's a lot of wisdom that schools have and often not the time and the facilitation to be able to bring these ideas together. We also like bringing partners together across districts because many districts in the state are struggling with these things and often aren't given an opportunity to talk and learn from one another. So that's another thing that we as a community partner do. I would say the other community partners that I've seen along my career, culturally specific providers are very important. And these are organizations that are often founded and led by cultural communities that they serve. And they tend to have deep trust with the families. And so when a school has struggling with maybe not all populations of children, but certain populations of children, those culturally specific providers often can be a bridge builder between the school and the family and work in concert with them to help with attendance. Another partner we've seen be particularly effective in our rural areas are our health partners. And in Yoncalla, which is one of our smaller rural communities, they hired a nurse on site to serve the community because they found that the attendance issues were often related to health. And they didn't, rural and remote communities, access to healthcare is much more difficult, and people did not have a way to get to a doctor. And so these health partners serve both the children, and we focus on the early years, early grades side, not middle and high school, but they serve the children and the family, and they saw a direct impact on attendance from that. And then I would say the other partners are just social service providers. Transportation is a barrier. We see it in rural areas. We also see it with certain populations. When you have economic distress, getting children to school sometimes is a barrier in and of itself. And we have seen partners enable the transportation piece to happen. You can't send a kindergartner on a bus, of public transportation easily. So how do you work with partners to solve the problem of transportation? And so those are the things I would summarize and illuminate that make a difference in solving some of our attendance issues.
Well, and Callie, what I'm hearing is to connect back to something you said earlier in the webinar, you got to deeply understand what the challenge are that families are facing. When you understand the challenge, it also helps you think about what partnerships you need to have in place in order to address the challenge. Joanne, how does that play out in your community in Iowa?
Yeah, and as we think about that, and we actually reached out to our community partners, and as we were working with them, you know, we focused on the outcome piece of it, and what they share with us is what they would like is employees who come to work regularly. So they are seeing the impact of regular attendance, maybe the mindset changing. They're seeing that in their employees as well. And so they know that this is a possible win-win situation. So as Callie had just said, they want to be part of the solution. And so they are really eager to work with us. We have some partners, we have Meta and different partners that help us with grants. So when you talk about things like home visits, et cetera, we have some grant partners that we're able to work with. We have mental health therapists who come in from different organizations who come into the school, so the kids don't have to leave for therapy sessions, but they can receive those on site and then get right back into class. We learned recently that some of our new students who are learning English as a new language, they weren't able to get vaccinations for 2 weeks for an appointment, and they couldn't start school. So reaching out to our health partners, and if we just have those open lines of communication, we all want the same thing. And so if we're able to partner and find those things together, we're finding pathways and opportunities to collaborate, problem solve, and support students at the same time.
So I'm hearing some cross-cutting things. One is got to know the challenges. That helps you figure out partnerships, and you got to invest in cultivating the partners so that they know their interests, like I need employees who will show up on time, in actually partnering with you.
Exactly.
So that is so helpful. I'm going to shift us for a moment because we've been looking at how we do this in different places, but we also know that we got to figure out how to take this to scale. The fact that we've had chronic absence double as a country, the fact that it's remained high, that we still have to invest in re-engagement means we have to have more places taking on the kind of fabulous strategies that are in place. And I'm curious if we could start with, maybe go back to Callie for a second, and then Kari, and then we're going to actually ask Nancy from EdTrust to talk about how this connects with some of the research they've done on family engagement. But what do you see as some of the keys to taking this work to scale?
I think one thing, and it's been said already, but it can't be underscored enough, this idea of belonging and helping children know that they are valued and seen and that people want them in school is very important. Oregon passed the Every Child Belong Act at the state level that really illuminated and supported districts to center belonging in all that they did. And I think when you start with belonging and when you start with valuing children, it's a much easier proposition, and their families, it's a much easier proposition, and it begins to change the culture of schools where you get away from sort of that more punitive approach, and you focus on seeing the whole child, seeing the whole family, and welcoming them in. And that we have seen research-wise is huge. Another thing Oregon has done is
And Kelly, I'm just going to ask them to take off the slides for a second because that's about Connecticut. I want them to hear you. And
I
then
can't.
when Kari comes back, we'll bring back that slide. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we were fortunate to have a major legislative act in 2019 that's called the Student Success Act, and that was a $2.35 billion investment in Oregon education every 2 years. So it's $1 billion of investment in early learning and K-12 that is specifically focused on improving outcomes, in particular for the students who are most underserved. And in our community, there's a lot of children that fit into that category, as you can imagine, and what you see in your communities. And I think that investment signaled to schools, we're going to prioritize strategies, and the districts can design what strategies they are, but recognizing the importance to have some resource to support strategies that support children in attendance. So I would say, in addition to having practices that matter, having funding that supports it is important, and having that leadership at the top. And I would say our leadership has said, we've started an Everyday Matters initiative to increase regular school attendance. And that's, the state superintendent on down saying, we see attendance as a priority issue. There's investment that supports it, and we want to see progress on these areas. And we want to, provide measures and illuminate best practices around what's happening. So those are some things I think are important to scale. You need to be clear on what practices matter and support and begin to change school culture and climate that to be conducive to those practices. I think you need funding and investment, and then you need to have leadership at the top saying this is a priority. There are a lot of things happening in schools. And so unless we prioritize every day and prioritize it along the continuum, as you said, Hetty, it's very easy to focus on high school and middle school, and they are important. But when we have half of kindergartners not showing up, we've got a huge issue, a huge problem. And what we try to do at CI is help people understand kindergarten is not babysitting. This is actually the fundamental time where the brain is developing and the most accelerated learning is taking place. So we need to ensure that children are there for it.
Thank you, Kelly. And I want to just yeah, absolutely. I was thinking, though, there's another example of where Oregon has made a huge difference. And this is with the Tribal Attendance Promising Practices Program, TAP. Because in Oregon, started with the research again, figuring out that chronic absence was a huge issue. This was before the pandemic, but then led to the tribes working together to get legislation passed so that you could have programs that were culturally, linguistically appropriate and organized. So it was tribes and school districts working together. And there was a moment before the pandemic where you were seeing in Oregon reductions in chronic absence for Native American students, and it wasn't yet happening statewide because there had been such an explicit attentional investment with key stakeholders working together to ensure those resources were there. So I think you've got a tried and true formula around the leadership and the legislation. Now, Kari, and now we can bring up that slide. What have you seen help to move things to scale in Connecticut?
So as a state in Connecticut, we've had a long commitment to attendance and family engagement. And using family engagement to improve student attendance. We've had legislation back in 2015 that required all districts and schools that had a certain threshold of a chronic absence, they were required to have district and school attendance teams. We have a commissioners roundtable for family and community engagement that meets quarterly that includes all of the community partners that represent our families so that their voices are at the table. We have, it was put in the chat earlier, but in 2018, we developed a full, equal, and equitable partnership, a framework and definition for family engagement. And embedded in that is a great chart, chart 5, and it talks about what does high impact family engagement look like in reducing chronic absence. And it shows you what a low impact might be, and then how you might get to a high impact. So we've had this commitment not only at the high level, but across our district, our departments. So we have cross-divisional teams that support our least performing schools. Attendance is on that team. I represent attendance. The districts have attendance goals. Family engagement's part of that team. And we have a state attendance advisory team so that we can hear from the districts, how can we help you? Because I have to say that that's one of the things Connecticut has been, like we say, to change your mindset on how you work with families, you have to change your mindset with how you work with districts as well. You have to be partners with them. You have to be empathetic with them. They're not creating these problems. And we're not talking about chronic absence to ding a district or to penalize a district. It's data that helps us to support you and where to support districts. So we also in Connecticut have been very fortunate to have a performance office that has provided data on our website. We used to provide it every year at the end of the school year. It would usually come up in the fall. We'd have the annual chronic absence rates, and you could go on there and look at them by student group, by grades, by district, by school. But when the pandemic started in September of 2021, when we came back to school, we started issuing monthly data reports on chronic absence and attendance in this seems so long ago, but attendance in virtual learning versus remote learning versus hybrid learning, so we could compare. We use that data to inform how we invested in strategies like LEAP to improve attendance. That data was crucial for us to know who were the kids who were missing the most school, how were they doing academically, and how can we support them. So I would have to say that, have this longstanding commitment. We're marrying family engagement and student attendance. We've integrated the commitment across our departments. So I work very closely across the agency, and we use our data to inform state level investments, including our capacity building and peer learning network opportunities for districts. We use that data. We have something called Talk Tuesday that happens every other Tuesday. It's a network where anyone in the state who wants to talk about attendance comes, but we use our data to determine what will the topics be that we're going to talk about. And so, by the way, go ahead.
Yeah, I was curious. So have you seen a difference statewide?
Yes, so we have seen a difference. If you want to show the next slide, I saved our data for last. You'll see the orange bars are our high need students. In our accountability system in Connecticut, high need students include students with an IEP, students eligible for free meals, and our multilingual learners. And so you'll see we peaked in 2021-22 with our high need students at 34% and our all students at 23.7%. And we've thankfully started to see these numbers come down. And so for all students, we came down to 20% for the end of last school year, 2023. And in October, we saw it decrease to 17.8. And so we're really pleased to see these numbers coming down, and we are just working as hard as ever to improve attendance in our schools.
That is so impressive, Kari. I know this work doesn't happen over time. The trauma, the impact, the challenges of the pandemic are something that still are with us. But what I think your data really shows is with intentional approaches, we can keep getting improvements, and eventually we'll get even further improvements. So this is so exciting to see. I want to now actually invite Nancy from EdTrust to join us, because they've been looking at family engagement strategies and what's happening across the country. And I wanted to ask Nancy to share with us, how does what you hear connect with what you've been able to see from the research that EdTrust has been able to carry out?
It connects really well. So at EdTrust, just for a little information on our studies, EdTrust conducted a mixed method study involving 2 nationally representative surveys of parents and teachers, interviews with family engagement coordinators, and an online discussion board of 30 parents who had a child in 1st or 2nd grade. Many of the findings overall were positive, with parents and teachers reporting positive feelings about engagement opportunities at their children's schools, with communication with their children's teachers, with their role in school-wide decision-making and the cultural inclusiveness of their schools. But when we examined more specific engagement offerings, there's a more nuanced picture that emerged. And I think the various approaches that we heard from these panelists really reflects a lot of crucial efforts that can address a lot of the things that we heard in our study. And so, for example, we heard that many parents reported experiencing a lot of barriers to engagement, like scheduling conflicts, lack of transportation, childcare. And so they would really welcome a broader range of opportunities to engage with their child's school. And so the efforts we heard from everyone here around the multiple avenues to reach parents, from phone calls and letters, of course, but to also things like empathy interviews and home visits, to building awareness with social media. All of these things, this diversification of approaches is really what parents need, given their busy lives. And I also want to note, we heard so much about practices around understanding the root causes of why students are absent, and that is just so crucial, right? And I think similarly, we want to also identify the root causes of why some families aren't engaging, and see if we can address the barriers that they're experiencing as well. So for example, if transportation is an issue, getting to school to engage with your teacher, home visits are a great way to get around that, right? And so I also want to think a little bit more deeper about just generally what we want to see. We want to see better quality in terms of the family engagement opportunities that families have, and we want to see better access to those opportunities, right? So we found in our research that parent-teacher conferences were the most prevalent form of engagement, but too few parents had access to them. Only 2/3 of parents reported their schools offered parent-teacher conferences. And despite the promising research behind having even just one home visit and the importance of meeting with parents for relationship building, only 10% of parents say that their school even offers a home visit. Now, these two forms of family engagement are really important, particularly because they're good opportunities to connect around the social emotional development and needs of students, but also around their academic engagement, right? And one of the things that we heard is that only half of parents and teachers report that their schools are actually providing information about whether students are meeting academic expectations for their grade. And of parents who are not receiving this information, almost all of them reported that it would be very helpful to have that information. And so thinking about how we provide quality opportunities of family engagement that really give the opportunity to connect families and teachers and schools around what's happening in students' academic growth is just so crucial. And so lastly, I just wanted to dive a little bit into this piece around professional development and training that folks have talked about. We heard in our study that teachers really expressed a need for more time, professional development, and best practices to effectively engage with families. Similar to parents, many teachers also felt that they just didn't have the time, they didn't have the training, and only 58% of teachers reported that their school actually carves out time for family engagement, and 73% felt concerned that there isn't enough time in a day to engage with families. 66% expressed a desire for more professional development opportunities to better engage with families. And so we heard from all of the panelists here, right, about how important it is to make sure that there's intentional training and ongoing growth and professional development for doing things like home visits through training and support and accountability. And so one last statistic that I just want to say, if you recall, I said 10% of parents reported that their schools offer a home visit. Of those, 80% of the parents said that they didn't think that those home visits were done well. And so, and that's actually the lowest rating that we received of any engagement resource or activity. And so it's so important to make sure that the educators and the folks who are engaging with families have the support and the training to do so effectively with the right mindsets, as many folks mentioned today.
So Nancy, if someone's in a community and they're trying to think about where do they start? What would your advice be? They want to improve attendance. They think family engagement is key to it. Where would they start?
I think they would probably want to start with building the relationships with families, building that trust, making sure that they're listening to families. I think that's where things start, and then you can build from there. So I would, if I am not a district leader. I have never been a district leader, and I can't speak to that the way that these folks have. But I would take a hard look at what opportunities you currently have for parents to engage, figuring out what the barriers are and trying to address those.
So there's a question in the chat, and I'm just gonna put it out there because it's a tough one, about what happens when we listen to families. And I lays this to anyone here, not just Nancy. And they say, should we listen to what families are showing us about the way we do school following the pandemic? And that the amount of death that occurred made people reprioritize what is important to them. And people are making different choices about life. I was on a few radio shows where, families are like, well, I think I'm how do we respond to what are we hearing about the impact of the pandemic on how families view schools? And how do we take that into account in our work and our messaging with them? I don't know if anyone's, and Nancy, if you're, feel free to go, but anyone who might be able to think about it, because I think that is weighing heavy on people's minds. That somehow yeah.
I'm sure other folks have way better answers than me, but I will just say, I think the pandemic was really difficult across the board for everyone, right? And I think as students have come back, we've realized that the supports we provided pre-pandemic weren't enough to begin with. And now we really need to think about how we're addressing students' mental health, as well as like their general holistic development, and integrating that into accelerated learning as well. We can't see them as separate things. They are integrated. But I also think that, in terms of family engagement, the pandemic was, I think, maybe the first moment for a lot of people to realize that family engagement is incredibly important to making sure that kids understand what's happening within their schools and are learning. And I think in some places, unfortunately, it wasn't done well, right? We saw family engagement not take priority, and we saw a total loss of trust within schools. And we really need to rebuild that and bring it back. But we also saw in some places family engagement done really well. And we saw that it built this really great partnership for the first time between families and educators. And we really need to build off of that momentum.
Yeah, I think the Learning Heroes research really shows how if you had good family engagement before the pandemic, you actually had less increases in chronic absence. I also think there may be places where they didn't manage to sustain good family engagement or even have it in place. And now they have to figure out how to create trust. Other thoughts here, folks? How do we really take into account what the pandemic has meant to families?
I don't want to mansplain here, but I think it's exactly some of what we've been talking about, because I'm thinking what one of the folks here in Connecticut, Mike Myers out of Stanford, talked about in the height of COVID in Connecticut. And he said, we're being challenged to not only think outside of the box, but to get rid of some of these boxes. And so I think for some of these systems, some of these schools, they want to snap back to pre-COVID. And the families are like, no, that wasn't working before COVID. It definitely wasn't working through COVID. And now you want me to go back to the way you're determining it should be? And they're like, let's talk, right? So I think we need to create spaces where we're actually engaging, listening, as some of our colleagues here have been talking about, genuine listening, genuine cultivating partnership. And I think that'll help us get to move that back, not back the way it was, but to build relationships with families and earn that trust, build that respect, build those relationships.
I want to also ask a question. I know we've talked a lot about young kids, but there have been a few questions about high school. Any insights? And Joelle and I might lean on you a little bit because you have a K-12 district. What does it look like differently for high school students?
And that's a really good question. I was reading some of the chat, and part of what we're doing right now is we know if we set these routines and expectations that there will be benefits of that down the road. but we have students in front of us right now, and we need to know how to deal with that. We just finished up a round of student focus groups. So we got groups of students together, and we asked them, you know, what brings you to school, and what are the challenges of school? And it was interesting that at the high school level, friends was one of the top answers from everyone. So looking at the social group, but the other thing was being involved in clubs or extracurricular activities, because one girl said, I can't wrestle if I don't come to school. And so looking at our participation for all groups of our students to make sure that we have opportunities for them to participate in a way that is meaningful, so that they're feeling a part of the school community and feeling that draw to come to school each day. So it's a challenge, but I found the students were incredibly honest, maybe more honest than I was ready for. But the other thing is we need to keep them engaged while they're there. So we really need to look at what instruction we have. If they can go home and do it on the learning management system and they don't need the teacher, then we need to re-examine on how we are delivering and providing instruction. So it was very insightful, and we have a lot of steps to take in order to provide that support.
That's so helpful. Callie.
Yeah, and I know CI is not focused on high school. I do have a high schooler myself and have worked in the high school space. And I think something that has always struck me about high school age students, one, is that we don't listen to them enough. And this is something you said, Joellen, we have to listen to students at this age level, at this grade level. And they have a lot of wisdom to share about what's not working. And surveys that we've seen in Oregon in the past, one of the #1 reasons students dropped out or didn't like school is because they felt like their teachers, the adults in the building, did not like them, did not care for them. So going back to what we talked about earlier, that belonging, that care and connection, Joellen illuminated that, like friends, sports, clubs, like every human needs care and connection. And our schools are a place that have to, you know, it has to come out of the pores of every school building in order to keep children inside. And it is a little different with older youth because they have the agency to make the decision themselves. And we don't listen to them, and we don't prioritize that caring connection. I would say collectively, we, not Oregon or any particular state, but as a society, I think that is something that we need to do better so that we keep kids, high school kids, going to school.
You know, I am reminded a couple things. One is intergenerational strategies also came up in the questions. Intergenerational strategies with high school students taking the lead in helping to support the attendance of other kids. You can actually have them be as peer mentor, peer connect. It creates that. And it makes me think about, and this is something I think we can start doing from when kids are really little, but Bob Balthams talks about student connectedness, which is kids feel that there's an adult who cares about them. They feel there's peers they can connect to and care about them, that they are engaged in something pro-social that supports their community, and they feel welcome in school. And I also think I'd add to that the curriculum feels relevant and engaging, because that, you know, is core to school. But when you have those things, kids really will show up, and we got to start fostering that connection from the day kids are really little, so that by the time they're in high school, they still feel those connections. One last question, and then we'll shift. There was questions about when you have families that have multiple households and different kinds of structures. Just curious, how do people address that kind of situation?
That's difficult. It's a difficult situation. I got a lot of calls at the state. So I think from parents where one parent is not sending the child to school and the other isn't. I think probably one of the schools can answer it better, but providing, you know, the social emotional support for the family and helping them to see what's best in the best interest for the student. But that is, if someone has the answer, that would be great.
Angela, I'm wondering as a principal, because I just don't mean to put you on the spot, but I can't imagine you haven't end up with families with complex structures. How have you had to found, what have you found helpful?
Yeah, I think it's an individual answer, right? And so you have to figure out what works for that family. So with families who have, split households, that's one thing where you need to communicate with both family members, not just the one that's easier to communicate with. Because usually in a separation situation, there's one parent who's really amicable and easy to communicate, and one parent maybe not as much, but you have to communicate with both. And then I would say for the families who have really complex situations where there's multi-generational families living together, or their situation changes frequently, it is figuring out what works for that individual family. We've gone to the point where we've made family trees, like where we have the grandparent up here, we have 5 adult children, their children all attend our school, they all have different last names. And then we create literally on an Excel sheet how all of these people are connected. And then, okay, this aunt is the aunt that you can talk to about any one of these kids because she will respond to you. And it's really just figuring out what works for an individual family, going through their emergency contact list, all of those things. It's not a one size fits all. I like to put my Nancy Drew detective hat on, figure out how I can get in touch with the families. That's the bottom line.
Boy, that is quite an image, Angela. And it makes me remind of working with some schools where literally in prep, Nancy, for the parent-teacher conferences, they started talking together about who were the kids were chronically absent. And then you notice that 3 or 4 that, they're all from the same family and they now have different teachers. And how do you both map out who all in the school? So that's the other side of your family tree there, because then you actually have to coordinate how you support each other across both pieces. But I think it's that intensive relationship building and thinking through how do you build both upon the school staff as well as all the family members in an intentional way that gets us to solutions. I was going to ask Francisco one last question because I just know that you do this. I had seen some questions about where folks feel like they've tried everything, but it's still not working. What's your advice when someone faces that situation?
So perhaps, maybe, just maybe, what the family's doing is they're waiting for somebody they can believe in. And maybe you trying certain techniques or whatever is great, but it's not about the technique, it's about the relationship. And so if they've only been burnt or received negative communication, from a school system, and then we call, right? And I see this all the time. You call and the family's gonna test you. Because maybe they've had experienced some systemic structural traumas through their education as a child, and they brought that into with their children and their parenting, right? So, or maybe they've just been burned by different structures and systems, et cetera. So they want to test you and see, is this person real? Does this person have my interest and that of my children in mind? And maybe they want to connect with you, but they just want to see what you're made of, right? And they're going to test you a little bit. So don't say that you've tried everything, because until we've tried to connect with families and meet them where they're at and be genuine and authentic with them and to earn that trust, then all the different strategies and tools and tricks will make sense and they'll land better, right? And it's the same thing when it goes south, when there's a problem or an issue that does have to be discussed. If we have authentic, genuine relationships with families, those things are easier to hear and to deal with because you've earned that trust. Trust takes forever to build and a second to lose. And for a lot of our families, they've had a long time of where they just have not been able to build trust with our systems. That's just the hard facts. So it's gonna take time, right? So what I tell home visitors when they call and say, what do I say if a family doesn't want to talk to me? I'm like, well, you can't force them. You're not deputized to go bang on their door and scare them at dinner time with the courts. That's not this, right? What I would say is I hear you don't want to talk right now. Cool. If it's all right with you, I'd like to call you back at another time and see. And then they'll wait. They'll be like, all right, cool. And then you call them back. Show back up. Don't give up on the families right away. But again, there's limited bandwidth, limited capacity. I know that sometimes if a family says, yeah, no, I'm not interested, go away, we're going to have to call their families, right? So time isn't just always there. But I think families are going to make us earn that trust. And I think that's for many, many reasons.
On that note, eloquent note. Thank you, Francisco. I'm going to turn it back to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading to end us up.
Thank you so much, Hetty, and thank you to our entire panel for sharing all of these wonderful strategies, your perspectives, inspiration. I think based on the chat, a lot of people are feeling inspired and really appreciative of the work that you all do. Thank you to everybody who joined us today for this session to listen to our wonderful panel speak. Thank you for all the questions there. We just didn't have time to get to all of them, but we really appreciate you asking the questions, engaging with each other in the chat. It's really wonderful to see. Last thing, I want to remind everybody about our upcoming webinars. You can see these on our website as well. And thank you again for joining us. It was wonderful to see so many of you here. Thank you to our panel and have a great rest of your day, everyone.